This is James Sandy. Today is July 24th, 2024, and I'm interviewing Dr. Ron Milam. This interview is taking place on Zoom and is sponsored by the UTA Department of History and Geography as part of the Texas Veterans Project. Thanks for participating, Ron. It's a pleasure to chat with you today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Okay, so just to get started, tell us, where are you from originally? What can you tell me about growing up?
I was born in San Diego, California. My father was a naval officer, supply officer, getting ready uh, to proceed on Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan, on the ground, of course, which never happened, thank goodness. So I was born just a few months after that. Um, in San Diego. Lived a lot of different places after that, but San Diego's where I was born.
Okay. Your dad was in the Navy. How long did he serve?
Yeah, he actually was. He enlisted in the Navy in 1942, late 42, and served for 43, 44, and 45. He was a naval officer, supply officer. They sent him, he had a good deal. They sent him to Harvard University to get his MBA, and which he didn't quite ever complete because of the war, but that's where he took his naval training, was at Harvard. So not a bad deal.
Yeah, that's a pretty slick little setup.
Yeah.
So you guys moved around quite a bit?
Yeah, my dad was in the oil and gas industry, so we moved all over America, starting out in West Texas, Oklahoma, um, Kansas, Illinois, that sort of thing, and ended up in Michigan. So I spent my teenage years in Michigan.
Gotcha. And are you brothers and sisters?
I have an older sister who sadly died back in 2017, and a younger brother who sadly died in the same year, 2017. So I was a middle child.
Gotcha. Um, so moving around so much as kids, were you guys pretty close?
Yeah, I would say growing up we were. We all went our separate ways after we got married, so to speak. But yeah, we were close growing up.
Okay. Um, so moving to, you said you moved to Michigan where you went to high school, is that correct?
Yeah, I moved to Michigan when I was, I think, 12 years old, and stayed there until I went in the army, and then back and forth after that.
Okay. Uh, was that near Detroit?
Yes, actually, I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan. You hear about Dearborn, Michigan being the I guess the largest city of Arab Americans, and that's the school that I went to, was mostly Arab Americans.
Hmm.
Dearborn, Michigan. Yeah,
Hmm. Um, what was
home of
what?
home of the Ford Motor Company.
Okay, I was wondering. That it sounds familiar for
Yes.
a couple reasons. Um,
hmm
okay, so you went to high school there. How was that?
Yeah, I went to high school at Dearborn Fordson High School. Um, Yep, state football champions and a lot of other sports. We were a good school to go to.
Gotcha. What do you remember about living in Michigan? Like once you guys moved there, what was life like there for you guys?
I remember it being a lot different. I'd lived, by the time I got there, I'd lived in several different states, and it was a lot different. Like I say, it was very ethnically Arab Americans. It was also known, sadly, I guess we could say, also known as being one of the largest all-white communities in America. And it was a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. Uh, and I went to school there, went to high school there, went to college there. So yeah, and it's still considered to be a kind of one of my home places. Sure.
For sure. Do you remember anything that about those two kind of descriptors you just listed, or how did those kind of interact with one another? Do you remember any of those from your childhood there, or your kind of growing
Well,
up?
Detroit, Michigan is, of course, the automobile capital of then the automobile capital of the world. This is before Japanese cars were starting to come to America. So Detroit was the motor capital of the world, and both my wife worked for the woman who became my wife worked for General Motors, and her whole family was from Ford Motor Company. So we were always GM people, and her family were all Ford people. So it was always an interesting place. And we got married, and we actually lived through the 1967 riots in Detroit, Michigan, which became very famous for a lot of the wrong reasons, I guess we could say. But it was part of that whole 1960s period of time that we have all studied about.
Yeah. Um, so what year did you graduate high school?
1963.
1963. Okay. What did you do in high school? What kind of activities did you participate in? What were you kind of into?
I was a cross country runner. I was a tennis player. Um, I was president of the my junior class, and involved, I guess, in local politics, you could say. I met my girlfriend, and I got married a few years later. So I guess you could say I was just an average young guy in Detroit, Michigan. We were known as there were two kinds of people that lived in Detroit, Michigan, there or in Dearborn, Michigan. There or in that area, there were what they called the cake eaters and the greasers. And I went to a school of greasers, and we were the tough guys. And the rich people all lived in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and that was our conference football rivals. All sports really, but we were kind of known as since most of my friends, most of their parents worked for the Ford Motor Company at the River Rouge plant, and were blue collar workers. My father was not, but anyway, I was involved in all of that. So it was a great life growing up, though.
It sounds like the all-American experience. Um,
Absolutely.
did you have any sense of joining the military? Were you interested in ROTC? You know, your dad's service. What place did the military occupy for you as you're entering high school and thinking about kind of what you're going to go do?
The military offered no interest to me whatsoever. My father had only been in the Navy for 3 years. During World War II, I kind of grew up watching Victory at Sea, hearing about my dad's stories about the Navy, although he was never on a ship. So from my perspective, war and military matters were all things that I had seen in film. Um, Growing up, of course, I didn't even have television till I was 12 years old, I guess. So I didn't know about that, but I remember going to war movies. But I had no interest in the military whatsoever. I think we probably played cowboys and Indians more than we played war growing up.
Okay. So you said you graduated high school in 1963. Did you attend college?
Yes, I attended Henry Ford Community College for 2 years, and then I attended Wayne State University for 2 more years, earned my bachelor's degree in industrial relations, it was called, which is kind of more of what we would call today, I guess, HR management. And then I went on and earned a master's degree in business administration in 1968. So I guess I was in school for 5 years, 2 years at community college, 2 years undergrad, and then a year of graduate school.
Okay. So why did you pick to study what is, industrial relations, human resources? What drew you to that?
My father was a businessman, and I guess I didn't know anything different than that. I just thought that that's how you made tell you that was the degree that would give you the best opportunity of eventually getting a job and having a successful life. I got married while I was in college, and so it just made sense to get that kind of a degree. Yeah.
Okay. And your wife, did she attend college same time, same place? What was she doing at this time?
She actually went to work for General Motors very young in her life, so she was a career person. So when we got married, she was a teletype operator handling all the main communications for General Motors worldwide.
Interesting. Um, okay, so you mentioned, you go to Henry Ford Junior College. Hard to get away from Henry Ford in Dearborn, I guess.
Yeah.
And then you go finish your bachelor's and then immediately into a master's. This whole time, Vietnam is escalating, percolating in the background. Is this something you're thinking about? Is this something that is, what are your thoughts? What do you remember about the war and what's happening at this part of your life?
I remember in 1965, I don't remember much about it until 1965. Um, and when America introduced ground troops in March of 1965, I was just finishing my, let's say, I guess I was in my junior year maybe of undergrad. And I remember people talking about what this meant. And I can remember the anti-war movement at Wayne State University, where I was attending school. I can remember the anti-war movement really starting even that early. So I did pay attention to the war as best I could, watching it on television by that time. But I don't remember. I don't remember. It seems to me the bigger discussions about everything in those days was Cold War oriented, more about, well, because America was not recognizing Red China, as it was called. And so I remember being mostly concerned about what the bigger picture of what it would mean if America went to war with China, more so than anything about Vietnam. But I did pay a little bit of attention. And then, of course, 66 happens, 67 happens. And then in late 67, which would be the end of my 4 years in college, I got my draft notice. And then I started paying a lot of attention to it.
Yeah. So just go back real quick. You said there were anti-war kind of sentiments on campus. I mean, SDS is founded, very close to where you are. And so what was that like? What did that look like at Wayne State?
Well, the University of Michigan was the hotbed of most of the anti-war activities in Michigan. Port Huron, Michigan's where SDS was founded, of course. And so I did pay attention to it. My wife's sister was active in the anti-war movement. Her whole family was active in the anti-war movement. So I paid close attention to it. But then I got the draft notice. And the draft notice said that I had to report for duty. And they had a program in those days called the College Option Program. And the College Option Program said that if you wanted to enlist and you were already enrolled in school, and I had just been accepted into the graduate program in business at Wayne State University, that you could take an examination. And if you scored high enough on the examination, you could stay in school and finish your graduate degree. If you committed then to going into the military after and going into the officer program after you completed your master's degree, so I did that. I signed up to complete my master's, go into the college option program, and tell the Army that I would go in the day after I earned my MBA. That was the plan. And they also told me, interestingly, I think, that once I get my MBA, that I could go into the finance corps. And with a degree in finance, or degree in my case, I was in management and marketing, but that degree, I would go to a place called Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis, and I would become part of the adjutant corps, and therefore I would be I would essentially be an officer who oversaw supply or personnel S1 kind of thing, kind of like what my dad was doing. Now, prior to that, I did, knowing that as soon as I got my draft notice, I went down and tried to get in the Navy, and my math scores weren't good enough. And so I didn't get in the Navy. And then I went down and applied to get in the Air Force, and my eyes weren't good enough to get in the Air Force. Um, so that left me with just one option, and that was the Army. So I applied and got accepted and was ready to go to Fort Benjamin Harrison as soon as I graduated. And then a thing called TET, 1968 happened. And they called me and they said, Mr. Milam, we still want you in this man's Army, but you won't be going to Benjamin Harrison. We're going to close all those non-combat places down. And if you want to if you want to become an officer in the Finance Corps or the Adjutant Corps, you have to go to Infantry OCS. And you have to graduate in the top 3 of your class to choose the Finance Corps. Not 3%, top 3. So I went to Infantry OCS after basic AIT, airborne, all those things, and did not graduate in the top 3. So I was commissioned in the infantry.
That's quite the saga from draft notice to several years later, kind of the full circle. So you graduated your MBA in 1968.
Yes.
And right into training. And where'd you go to basic?
Friday night, I earned my master's degree on Friday night, and on Saturday morning, I got on an airplane and flew to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and took basic training, Fort Dix, and then I was sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for advanced infantry training, and then and I had already been accepted into Infantry OCS. So I went down to Infantry OCS at Fort Benning, Georgia, Thanksgiving of 1968. And as soon as we got there, they told us that our barracks were not ready, that there'd been a mix-up in the Pentagon, and because our barracks weren't ready, we had 2 choices. We could pull KP for the next 3 weeks and then go to OCS by the middle of January, or we could go to airborne school. And so we talked about it amongst our buddies, and I was one of the guys that said, "Are you kidding me? I don't want to go jump out of airplanes." But all my buddies were going to jump out of airplanes, so that's what I did. I went and jumped out of airplanes all over the Christmas holidays of 1968. And then went to OCS in the middle of January of 1969.
What were your parents' kind of reactions to you joining? I mean, obviously, you got the draft notice, so it's less a decision. But what do you remember talking to them, your dad, about what it's going to be like or anything? What do you remember about that?
My dad was very upset with me being in the Army. I won't want to exactly say he was against the war, but I guess we could say he was against the war from the standpoint he didn't quite understand why we were fighting 9,000 miles away. He was I remember him telling me that he was kind of a lifelong Republican, and LBJ was the first Democrat he ever voted for, and he pretty much went to his grave saying that if LBJ hadn't been elected, I would have never had to go into Vietnam. Of course, I know that not to be true, but that was kind of the way he felt. He was very much against the war, and so he was not happy about it at all. And then he was even less excited about me jumping out of airplanes because he had to tell me all of the reasons that jumping out of airplanes was dangerous, and that he would quote to me all the times when I was younger and playing football, and somebody would tackle me hard, or I'd get my knee hit and I'd pass out, and told me that's what's going to happen. You're going to jump out of that airplane, hit your knee on the side of the airplane, and pass out. And so he told me all these reasons why I shouldn't jump out of airplanes. And of course, I had to tell him that, Dad, I'm probably going to go to Vietnam. So jumping out of airplanes seems pretty easy right now.
Man. What about your mom?
Yeah, she was a typical mother. She didn't want me in playing around with guns or any of that kind of stuff. So, yeah, nobody was really in favor of it. And then I had the other side of my family. My wife's family were all active, really active in the anti-war movement,
Mhm.
going to Washington, D.C. as part of the demonstrations and everything else. And so they definitely didn't understand why I hadn't gone to Canada, because all I had to do was walk across the bridge from Detroit and I'm in Canada. And it was an option. We chose not to do that.
Yeah, and your wife Maxine, what was that like? You guys hadn't been married that long, and I'm assuming your entire time off training, you're off on your own.
Yeah, we got married in 66, September of 66. And here I am in the Army 2 years later. And so, yeah, she wasn't real happy about the whole thing. She came to visit me once in Philadelphia when I was at basic training in Philadelphia, when I was at Fort Dix. And then see, I don't think I didn't see her again then until I went to until after airborne school. But yeah, she wasn't real happy about it. But she did go with me to OCS. Well, that was good.
Well, that's good. When you get to Fort Dix, you get to Fort Polk. Is I'm assuming it's Vietnam 24/7. This is the point of the Army, right?
Pretty much. We had one advantage going for us. Everybody that went to Fort Polk, you knew if you went to Fort Polk, you were going to Vietnam, because that's where Tigerland was. And Tigerland was the last week of your training before you then had 2 weeks leave and then you went to Vietnam. But all of us that were OCS bound knew we had another at least 6 months. And then they came up with another rule during this time that if you were in OCS, if you graduated from OCS or ROTC, you had to have at least 4 months of troop training before you shipped off to Vietnam. So from our perspective, here we are we went to Polk in October, November of 1968. Paris peace talks had just started. And we knew that we had almost a whole nother year with 6 months of of OCS and then 4 months of troop training. We figured, man, this war is going to be over. They're already talking about ending it in Paris. So we're just kind of going through our thing. So we kind of enjoyed Fort Polk, enjoyed watching all these other guys have to worry about going to Vietnam, but not us, because we were going to be officers, infantry officers.
Yeah. And how was OCS? How was that experience?
It was good training, but when I think back on it now, OCS was infantry OCS. It was very much focused on Europe. It was very much focused on tank warfare. It was very much focused on nuclear warfare. Um, we did have some Vietnam training, and of course, we trained on all the weapons of Vietnam, and we trained on helicopters. We did all the helicopter training that was kind of new to the Army. But we all knew we were going to Vietnam. But it's always been interesting to me that the Army was still so focused on Cold War activities as opposed to just finishing the war in Vietnam. Almost all of our cadre were Vietnam veterans, mostly African American, all really good war experienced guys. And I think they did a good job with us in OCS.
What was that like going in and then going through the training with individuals who had already been to Vietnam and seen this conflict that, is living in your head, like, oh, am I going to go here? Am I going to experience this?
Yeah, scared the shit out of us. Everything that they did was we knew they had survived it, and the death tolls were pretty high then because it was coming out of Tet, and we paid very close attention to the news, and it wasn't something that any of us looked forward to. but we also knew that we were going to get 4 months. So we graduated in June of 69. We were the only airborne qualified OCS class in history. Every 75% of us were airborne qualified, and none of our TAC officers were. And so we thought we were really pretty hot shit, that we could jump out of airplanes and wear those wings on our uniforms. We're pretty proud of ourselves, pretty tough guys. But then we all knew that it was going to end and we were all going to get our duty assignments. I was very fortunate. My first duty assignment right after OCS was as executive officer and Pathfinder platoon leader of the 82nd Airborne Division, 1st Brigade. And so I got to go to the 82nd and Fort Bragg and continue to jump out of airplanes, which I all of a sudden really loved everything about it. I think I made 28 jumps. I got to jump into Turkey, got to meet General Westmoreland in Turkey on a Operation Deep Furrow. So I enjoyed all my post OCS time as a commander, small unit commander.
Okay, so you end up in the 82nd. Sounds like you're doing kind of a lot of exercises, overseas
Yeah.
duties. Is it a full deployment? What brought you to?
It was a full deployment. The whole 1st Brigade. We jumped into Turkey. I was Pathfinder platoon leader, so I got to set up the drop zones for the rest of the brigade to fly in and jump in after us. And then I got to spend 2 weeks pretty much just hanging out. Got to, like I say, serve coffee to General Westmoreland. And I didn't have much to do because then I was in charge of the redeployment of the entire brigade back to Fort Bragg. And that took 3 weeks. So I was in Turkey for 5 weeks, 2 weeks on the operation, and then 3 weeks getting all the equipment back. But we jumped into a drop zone that had been reconned, and it was a cornfield supposedly, and that was what the recon said. But then at the last minute, when we got ready to make our jump, I was in the door, of course, platoon leader, first guy out, standing in the door. I had a camera around my neck, take pictures, and we make the jump. And the cornfield had been cut just about 2 days before down to about this high of practically punji stakes. And so we jumped into that stuff and we're all got skinned up really well. I dropped my camera, came off. I had my M16, I had my equipment bag on and all that kind of stuff. But for me, like I say, it was good. The jump itself was horrible. When the 82nd came in behind me, the whole 1st Brigade, we lost so many vehicles. It was a really Charlie Foxtrot, man. It was. It was a mess. But we got to watch, and we jumped in aside the Turkish army and the Greek army. We were all carrying M16s with blanks. They were all carrying M16s with real live ammo. They hated each other. So we got to watch that interaction between the Greeks and the Turks. But yeah, it was a good time. It was a good time.
Wow. And this is all post OCS before you go to Vietnam.
Yeah, then I got my orders. In October, I got my orders to go to, I started with the 82nd in June. So June, July, August, September. And then in October, I got my orders to go to the Military Assistant Advisory Group, MATA School at Fort Bragg, starting January 15th, I believe it was, there at Fort Bragg for 8 weeks of language school and cultural school about Vietnam. And then upon completion of the MATA school, I would go to the Defense Language Institute at Fort Bliss, Texas, to complete my study of Vietnamese language to make me eligible to become an advisor in Vietnam.
So how did you get that? How did that happen from platoon leader to advisor? Was that something you requested? Did that just kind of happen?
No, That's a very good question. I think it was probably because of my degree. I had an MBA. The Army doesn't always make great decisions when it looks at personnel records, but they saw that I had an MBA. So therefore, and then the other thing is the American troops are all coming home. This is 1970 and 71 now. So they're bringing all the Americans home. So what are we going to do with all these guys? Well, we're going to put them in as unit advisors, or in my case, as a mobile advisory team leader. And so that's what they decided to do with me. And they had to make sure I could speak the language before I did that. So I went to language school I was actually in language school for 6 or 7 months total.
Yeah. How was your Vietnamese when you came out when you finished at Fort Bliss?
Army said I was absolutely fluent. And it means I passed the test at their level of being fluent. And then in the Army's wisdom, they sent me to Vietnam, and they sent me to they sent me to a place called Dian, Dian, where where all advisors had to go before they were put into a unit. And then, and so I was there for 3 weeks, I believe. And then they looked at all of our records and said, we're going to send this guy to a Jarai, Rade, Benar ethnic minority location up in the Central Highlands where nobody spoke Vietnamese. And so I took my great language training and went off and went to a place where nobody spoke Vietnamese.
Wisdom of the Army, right?
That's right. That's right. Now, some of it was good because there were Vietnamese officers involved. And so I was able to speak with them. By that time, I was probably more of a word guy than a fluent conversationalist. But I could still call in an airstrike in Vietnamese and stuff like that. So I could use my language skills a little bit, but basically that was what they did with me.
So you get to, when do you actually head off to Vietnam? What's that experience like? What do you remember?
Memorial Day weekend of 1970. And I still recall going to the airport, and my dad took me. My dad and my wife went, of course, with me. And my son, our son had just been born 3 months earlier. And so my mother stayed with him, and my dad and my wife took me to the airport there in Detroit, Michigan, Metropolitan Airport. And we ran into former Governor George Romney. In your generation, it would be Mitt Romney's dad. And he was then Secretary of he was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. I think he was the first HUD secretary under Richard Nixon. And I remember my father kind of getting into not exactly an argument with him, but, why the hell is my son having to go off to Vietnam kind of stuff. And Maxine and I had actually worked for George Romney during his presidential campaign of 1967. So we kind of knew who he was. And anyway, that was not a pleasant moment, but I got on the airplane and flew to Vietnam.
So you get to Vietnam, you get this assignment as an advisor. Were you excited about the idea of being an advisor? Was that something that you had kind of accepted? What were your thoughts on that job that you didn't choose, that just kind of is then, oh, you're going to go do this?
I knew that advisors were the future of the success of America, because we were this was, a year and a half after Vietnamization has actually started. Mm-hmm. And so because the Army, President Nixon had decided that the way to be successful in Vietnam is to have us training the Vietnamese to fight their war, I knew it was going to be a hard assignment, because Americans, everybody had gone home. And when I got there in June. I got there into May, and then by the middle of June, I was on assignment, and all the Americans had gone home from from our area. The 4th Division was on assignment to leave by October, 4th Infantry Division, and play cool. And we went on. I remember going on our very first operation 1 week after I got there, and we were in combat. Boom. My very first operation. We were in combat. And guys died. No Americans, but Vietnamese were being killed, both sides. And so I remember it being, oh my gosh, I got another 12 months of this. And I was thinking it couldn't ever get better, because now that we know the 4th is leaving, and therefore it's going to be a hard year.
That's really quick. So you mentioned there were other Americans there. How big was the team you were with, that you were in charge of?
I was sent in as a replacement for a mobile advisory team has 5 men, a captain, a lieutenant, a heavy weapons guy, a light weapons guy, and a medic. Those were the 5. And I was to be trained to be the mobile advisory team leader. And my guy was already on orders to leave. So I had 2 weeks with him before he left. In fact, the first combat operation I was on, like I say, was his last combat operation, my first. And then he left, and I was in charge. And that was 5 of us. And then there was another team at the same location. So that was 5 other guys. So that's 10. And then there was a district team of 5 men. So there was 15 of us in a district of, 3 or 4 million people.
Wow. And you were a first lieutenant at this point?
I was a second lieutenant, and 2 weeks after I got in country, I was promoted to first lieutenant.
Okay, so as the advisory team, you guys are living with, working with, kind of you're within the population, right? What was that experience like?
We were advisors to the regional forces and the regional force companies and the popular force platoons, as well as the People's Self-Defense Forces, all of members of the Jirai, the Rade, and the Banar tribes. They were terrific soldiers, just terrific. I don't have anything negative to say about any of them. They were defending their hamlets and their villages. And so we had 2 or 3 really good interpreters who could speak Vietnamese, could speak Rade, because those are oral languages, not written languages, and English. And they spoke very good. So my experiences with working with them were fine. The first, let's see, so I took over the team say around mid-July. So July, August, September, October, we'd go out on operations, and we'd get into small combat situations, several ambushes. We'd get ambushed on the highways, driving up and down the road on our Highway 14, which came right down the middle of the Central Highlands there. Highway 14 was one of the main arteries in Vietnam, and it was constantly mined by the Viet Cong, mostly in those areas. Then we didn't really see any of the NVA during those early days, and it wasn't a bad tour in that sense. It had elements of excitement from the standpoint of like I say, ambushes, moving people from the villages out onto the highways and stuff like that. So the first 3 to 4 months, up until around Christmas of 70, going into the new year of 71, it was just exciting enough to know that you were in a combat zone. but I don't ever remember up to that time. I sort of was looking forward to going home in June of the following year, and I can remember starting to apply for jobs back in the States. I'd sort of made up my mind I wasn't going to stay in the Army. So I had to start thinking about what it was going to be like when I got home. And then after January and February and March, all hell broke loose. Yeah.
Um, so how much, were you a big letter writer? Were you and Maxine in pretty regular contact as much as you could? I mean, I'm assuming because you're living out in a, kind of a regional area, how connected were you to home slash, the rest of the American effort in Vietnam?
Yeah, choppers came in every day. We were living in a district compound, so I actually had a room. We went out on operations from there. So I didn't go out on many men in American units that would go out on 2 and 3 week operations. I didn't do that. I'd go out on 2 and 3 day operations and come back to a relatively secure place with People's Self-Defense Forces guarding the whole perimeter. Felt relatively secure, although we pretty much January, February, we would get mortared every night, pretty much, and we had we had sandbags on the top of our hooches that could pretty well take a direct hit from a 60 mortar. 81 would shake you up a little bit, but felt relatively secure, I would say, at where we were living. And so, yeah, I set it up that I would write every day. But then I cheated a little bit on that in that we knew the choppers were coming in pretty much every day, but we also always anticipated that there would come a time when that might be difficult. So what we would do is we'd sit down on Sunday and we'd write 7 letters. And then we would we would have whoever was in the location, our cook or somebody would put a letter on the chopper each day. So back in the States, she was getting a letter every day. And I tried to say stuff that was interesting, although I'm sure most of it wasn't. So
Interesting. So you were working with this kind of pretty small group of Americans, correct? What was the relationship amongst you and the rest of the team?
yeah, it was a good group. Like I say, we had one officer on our team. I was mobile advisory team leader for about 6 months, and then they brought in a captain over me from Hawaii he'd been in the Army 23 years. He was an older guy. Brought him in, so I became the assistant mobile advisory team leader. But we had a good relationship. It was just a small group. Had one very, very well, I liked all of them, but I had one really close friend, Ed Roberg, who I sadly lost right in March of that year on our team. We had a Phoenix guy. We had medics. It was a reasonably good environment until mid-March of 1971, when our compound was overrun by PAVN soldiers. First time we'd fought the PAVN, or as we called them then, the NVA.
Wow. Yeah, so you mentioned, once January, February comes along, things escalate. And that's because there's a greater push by the PAVN, the NVA in that region, or yeah, what was going on?
I think what happened, I had just gone on R&R to Hawaii, met Maxine in Hawaii, and I told her then that I thought everything was going fine, and that I'd be home in 6 months. And so it took the PAVN, the NVA, probably that long to figure out that the entire province no longer had any Americans in it, because the 4th Infantry Division had been there since 65, and now here we are in 70. They've been there 5 years, and they deployed back to the States. And
This
There
is
were no more Americans.
this is Pleiku province, right?
Pleiku
Yeah.
province. Yeah, it's now called Gialai, Gialai, but then it was Pleiku province. And we were in Funyan district. And so along in January and February, we had a long air base right behind us. There's at least a runway, a dirt runway, and they would fly in these bird dogs, these Cessna 172s, and I'd call them in, and we would then go out on recons. Anytime I went out on an operation before, I would take the guys that come in and I'd fly the operation and see where we were going to be going the next day or two. And there started to be reports coming in that there were enemy activity, large enemy activity. This would have been in mid-February, I guess, that we started seeing signs like that. The reports were coming in. We had an intelligence guy that was assigned, an S2 guy that was assigned to the unit, to the district team, and he started saying, we're getting reports that there's a lot of stuff going on up in Khantoum province, just north of Pleiku, and that they're headed our way. And most of that was, they didn't really have good pictures of it. They were just reporting it in. And a lot of the S2 guys intelligence guys were denying it, saying, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. So, on March 15th of 1971, 11:30 or 23:30 hours, all hell broke loose. Rockets, the big rockets were coming in, 1 to 120 millimeter rockets. Bigger mortars were coming in. And the compound, and then we heard explosions right outside of our hooch. And a sapper unit of the PAVN had penetrated the compound, had gotten into the compound through the concertina wire that we had up. They had used Bangalore torpedoes to blow it open. They had come through the wires. They gotten into our generator bunkers where we had all the lights and everything, that all of our electricity was being run, blew that up, got into the NCO barracks where there was a huge poker game going on, had blown that up, and they were in the wire. And they were everywhere. And so I rolled out of bed, 11:30 at night, what the hell, and strapped on my 38 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol, grabbed my Car 15, and went out, and we had a fighting bunker on top of where our commanding officer's hooch was, and that was my fighting position. So I went up there with my buddy, Ed Roberg, and we had an M60 up there. And we looked out and we had them in the wire everywhere. I mean, I don't know how many hundred were out there. So we got a hold of our commanding officer, Major Ambrzak, and he called the Cobras in. And I ordered Ed to leave. My buddy Ed Roberg was a Phoenix guy. And we ordered him to leave because he was supposed to be taken to the most secure part of the compound, which was down by the communications bunker. And so I said, you got to leave. You got to leave. You got to go over there. And so he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay with me. And he went down there. And so I continued to fight from that fighting bunker. And then I got an order from my major to go over to the artillery compound and help them, because they had lowered their guns, and to go over there and help them coordinate everything that was happening there. And in the meantime, I see a medevac helicopter come in. Well, it's actually a medevac helicopter coming in with ammo also for us. And I see them putting my buddy Ed on that chopper, and he had taken a rock right between the eyes and pretty much, I think, killed him instantly. But he had 9 bullet holes in him when they landed him in Pleiku. Um, and it was hard. And then we fought for the next 2 or 3 days there, but we got the compound back. But we lost the compound for 6 hours. That is, they were in the bunker. They were inside the compound. Um, and the total death toll after the whole week was over 300. And one American, but most of the death toll was women and children of the People's Self-Defense Forces that were living in the perimeter around our compound.
Wow, that's really intense. So when that happened, did those non-combatants did they was the plan for them to come inside the compound and then it was kind of a circle the wagon
They
situation?
never got inside. They were killed in their bunkers
Oh,
by the overwhelming number of PAVN.
oh,
They went bunker to bunker and executed them.
oh.
And when we got the compound back, we called in the Cobra guns, and the gunships worked it over. And then there were so many PAVN retreating from the compound that most of them were executed. And so the mop up of bodies after it went on for the next 24 hours was pretty significant. Um, and I remember we had one of the forward air controllers, the fat guys flying in the Cessna 151s, flew down and picked me up. And there had been another FAC that had been shot down just south of us. And so I went on that operation to see if we could rescue those two guys, and we got them out. Their FAC had been shot down, so we rescued them. And every single one of our help, the women that worked as house girls, our cook, all disappeared. They were all gone. And we don't know if they were executed, or we don't know for sure whether it was exactly an inside job or if they were held liable because they were working for us. But on the bodies of many of the soldiers that we killed, we found complete blueprints, complete charts of our compound, including my hooch, my wife's name, and my son's name. So they obviously had a lot of good information about us. And all of the letters that Maxine had written me that I had stacked up, all gone.
Wow. I can't imagine what that realization must have been like, to know that they had that much information before that event.
They knew everything.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how does the compound like begin to move on from a moment, a battle like that?
Yeah. Well, we had lost, like I say, we lost Ed. They had some changes in personnel, but I stayed there for another 2 months. I pulled a lot of commo duty because I was scared. I admit I was scared shitless for the rest of my tour. I thought, man, if they could do that in one night, what else is going to happen? And I'm to this day, and of course, now that I'm a Vietnam War scholar, I've studied that battle a lot. I've done research on maybe writing a book on it, and I know that from what General Giap wrote in his Victory in Vietnam after action report, he considered that the Battle of Phu Nhan, the largest battle of that time of the war, was a significant test case on how 1975 would eventually happen. This is 71, and how the local people, the Montagnards, how they would respond once the PAVN made it down that far into the Central Highlands, because General Giap always said that he who controls the Central Highlands controls Vietnam, not because there's a lot of people there, but because of the transportation, getting in and out, it's the road to Saigon. Yeah, it's another 180 clicks, but it's still the way down. So so the next 2 months, I was there for another 2 months, I guess, 6 weeks maybe, and I took a leave of absence. I'd already taken my R&R, but I still had some leave of time that I could take, and I took some time and went to Hong Kong on R&R. But then when I came back from R&R, or excuse me, from leave, I volunteered every night to pull commo duty because that was the most secure place in the whole compound. I was scared. I wasn't sure I was going home.
Yeah, I can't imagine how you couldn't be in that moment, right? Um, I can only imagine what it was like to lose Ed after having, being a good buddy and someone that, you worked with for such a long time. Um,
Yeah, he was the old guy. I think he was 35.
mm,
And he'd been in the army since he was 17. He was an E7. He had five, he had one son and five daughters. And one of his daughters had just been born about the same time as my son. And the night that he was killed, we were together right up until he was killed. And that's all we talked about that night before we were hit was our kids. And he still had another, he'd only been there 3 months. So he still had another 9 months, and I only had another 3 months. So we talked about how someday maybe our kids would get to meet each other. Um, and then I was doing the math the other day, and I think he just turned 90. Or would have turned 90 had he lived. But yeah, he was special. He was a lifer that hated being in Vietnam. Loved the people, but hated Vietnam, and so we got along pretty well, even though he was a lifer and I sure as hell wasn't.
so those, those 2 months after that have to be really difficult. When your time comes up and it's time to go home, what's that like emotionally? What do you remember about that?
I remember I had a short timers calendar on my wall, and every day I would go over and, well, if I was in combat, I had a pen and I would circle the combat date. So I know every day that I was in combat for a whole year. And then I would put an X through that day's done. And I'd count the number of days left and call them a short timer's calendar. Um, and it got down to, and then we start, Army being what it is, start getting all these rumors. Oh, we're all going home early. Nixon's trying to get us all home. And so my DEROS date of expected return from overseas assignment was May 30th. That'd be 1 year. And about May 1st or so, I got word that they were going to take 20 days off of my tour of duty, that I was going to get to go home on May 10, which meant that I had to leave Funyan around May 2nd and make my way down to Saigon to process out. So they had a big party for me. I think it was May 2nd or May 3rd, something like that, big going away party. And then the next day, I had an escort group with a big deuce and a half and an armored vehicle and all that stuff. I didn't want to ride in that, but I said, you guys can escort me. I'll ride in the Jeep, ride shotgun in my Jeep, just like I had for a year. And son of a bitch, we get within about 10 miles of Pleiku City, and there's this place that we always call Dragon Mountain. You can look it up and see all kinds of battles that took place at background. We get ambushed, and I'm 10 miles away from Pleiku. And so, we roll out of the Jeeps and we chase a few guys off into the sidelines there. And I got a little piece of something on my hand, no big deal. And so that was that was my exit. And then I went to Pleiku and spent a night. And they did their debriefing of me from Pleiku, and then we flew to Nha Trang. And we go to Nha Trang, and we're in the and I went there and went to the officers club there at Netrang. And while we're in the rock, and while we're there, we get an attack. The officers club is attacked by 120 millimeter rockets being fired down from the thing. And we're all sitting there. I remember we're watching this. It was a cover band, a Philippine cover band of Philippine women singing American songs. And so we're all there listening to this band. And as soon as these rockets start pouring in, like everybody leaves except there's like three of us. And it's like, no big deal. That happens all the time. So we wanted to keep the band left too. And they're just sitting there drinking beer. So we stayed there a couple of days for more debriefing, and then went to Saigon and got 2 more days of debriefing, and then flew home to Travis Air Force Base in California.
That's reminds me of Will Eisner's last days in Vietnam, right? An exciting way to leave.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's that like getting home?
I remember going in. Well, I was did my I think I stayed in Thompson a couple of days, or I mean Travis a couple of days. Called Maxine and talked to her. Had a steak dinner, and then they gave me the recruiting pitch. Said, Lieutenant, we'd sure like to keep you in this man's army. In 2 weeks, you'll be captain. And I said, then? And they said, well, no, I said, then what? Where's my next duty station? And they said, anywhere in the world you want to go, accompanied or unaccompanied. And I said, then? And they said, well, you'll be back here. You'll be back in Vietnam as a company commander. And I said, oh, wow. I said, well, if I take you up on your deal, it'll definitely be an unaccompanied tour. My wife will not, she'll divorce me so fast. So I turned down the opportunity to stay in that man's army.
Was there any point during your time in the army where you considered maybe doing it longer than kind of the one enlistment?
Never. I don't ever remember sitting around thinking we're going to lose the war or anything like that. I sort of thought we'd end up just like Korea, be a stalemate, and we'd have a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. I really did believe that would happen because I didn't think that I could see Vietnamization not working, that we were not putting, that the Vietnamese soldiers, as damn good as they were, the whole government was so messed up that they couldn't fight the kind of war that was necessary against the communist North. I really did believe that. So I didn't like the army. I didn't like being told what to do. I became the most anti-establishment person that you can imagine. You know, I had an MBA, but I didn't care about working for any kind of organization that would be telling me what to do. I was off the deep end in that respect. So yeah, I didn't care anything about staying in.
So when you came home, right, you know, Vietnam was obviously a huge part of your life, but when you come home, what does Vietnam mean to the people walking around on the street? It's almost over, right? It's been over for a long time, right?
Yeah, nobody welcomed me home. For one thing, there were no parades and all that stuff. You know about that. We came home individually. I wanted to get out of my uniform as fast as possible. And it's kind of ironic that I came home on a Saturday, and I think it was a Saturday, and then Sunday was church, and my dad wanted me to wear my uniform to church. So for him, I did. And then on Monday, it was Mother's Day weekend. And then on Monday, my father was on the board of directors of the Detroit Economic Club. And on Monday, Admiral Zumwalt, who had just become the new chief of naval operations, was going to be speaking. And so Maxine and I went to the Detroit Economic Club, and my dad wanted me to wear my uniform, so I did. It's the last time I ever wore it. And we're sitting, he had nice seats up front, and somebody, it was back in the days of cameras with flash bulbs, and somebody took a picture and the flash bulb excited, blew up, and I dove under the table. And it's kind of embarrassing. I got to meet Admiral Zumwalt, and and then I remember that afternoon we went out and bought a car. That's the thing I'll tell you think about when you're away for your buying a car. Bought me a beautiful Camaro with a racing stripe on it, and uh, and then Maxine and I took our 1 year, 3-month-old son down to Myrtle Beach, traveled down there, and and say, "What are you going to do for a job?" I had no idea. And so my father was kind of a big shot in the organization, and so he got me an interview with one of the high-ranking finance people in this company that he worked for, and I interviewed and then turned the job down and didn't tell my dad, and instead took a job at a oil and gas processing plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and went to work as not a janitor. I wasn't good enough for that. I was a janitor's helper, and had an MBA, and helped change pistons on these big compressor stations, big compressor engines. And I did that for about 3 months. And my dad found out I had turned that really good job down, got all upset with me. And they interviewed me for another job and said, "Well, I'll tell you what, we'll send you to Louisiana." And that sounded better. So I got into the oil and gas industry as a janitor's helper, and I worked my way up after that.
Um, so you mentioned you didn't want to wear a uniform again. You had these couple moments. How long is it once you're back that you are officially out of the Army? How quick is that process?
That's a really interesting question, James, because I thought I was done and never thought any more of it. And then I finally got a DD 214 that said I was in for another 4 years, another 3 years. I was in the reserve, a 6-year commitment, because I was a reserve officer for the next 3 years, and I didn't even know it.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
So you served that out, I'm assuming.
I guess I did.
You had there was no more, you didn't show up for anything. There was no more kind of that you left, you were
No,
done.
no. In fact, I went back to school on the GI Bill, whatever version of the GI Bill that was, and earned another master's degree in political science, while I was in the oil and gas industry then for another over 20 years. So,
Wow. Okay, so
yeah.
yeah, so this second, this next chunk of your life, you're working for the oil gas industry. Um, you know, kind of generally, what was that like? Did you enjoy that part of your life?
Yeah, pretty much. I was in Detroit, Michigan. I worked my way up. I was head of environmental engineering. I had a lot of different jobs, property tax. Like I say, I earned an MA in political science at Wayne State while I was doing all that. Then they shipped me down to Houston, Texas. Um, After I'd worked for them for about 15 years. I was on the Board of Education, got into politics, um, and ran for office there locally and was elected a couple of times. Board of Education, president, Board of Education, kind of hung out in that sort of thing. Um, and then they shipped me off to Houston, and I had a real good job. I mean, a good job, paid well in Houston. I never really liked it very much. It was in lawsuits, a lot of lawsuits in court all the time, renegotiating contracts, um, and um, and realized I didn't like that at all, and then did that for another 20 years in Houston. Um, and then finally just quit. Just said, I don't want to do this anymore. Quit and went back to college, earned my PhD.
Oh. During that period, when you're working in the oil and gas industry, you're getting political in certain cases. Is your military service, kind of part of who you are at any point? Are you part of veterans organizations, or is that something you did and you left behind?
I left it totally behind. I didn't care anything about it. I didn't even tell people I was a veteran. I now and then I'd run into somebody that I would be about my age, and it seems like everybody that was my age, even in Houston, which is kind of a Texas military kind of thing, but I'd run into people my age, and nobody had been in the army, nobody been in the military, and they were all my age. What the hell? How come I'm in and you weren't? How'd that happen? And now and then I'd meet somebody. Like I remember the one of the highest ranking people at a corporation called Enron was named Tom White, and he became Secretary of the Army under President Bush, I believe maybe Bush 41, and yeah, it was right around the Gulf War, first Gulf War. And I remember talking to him and finding out he had been a Green Beret in an army. And I thought, damn, you're just like me. You got a little better job than me, but still. And so now and then you'd meet guys. I had a really bad experience with the VFW in Michigan when I was there. I tried to join the VFW and they didn't want me. They essentially said, well, you can come to our meetings, but you can't really be a member because I was a Vietnam veteran and these were all World War II guys. So I never really felt like I was in, and so after that, I didn't think anything about veterans organizations. No, I never joined any of them. Um, and never really even thought about Vietnam until I went back to school at the age of, my gosh, I was in my mid 50s when I went back to school.
Yeah. So you have this like amazing third act, right? You go back to school and eventually, earn your PhD in history, right? How did you come to that point where you're like, this is what I'm going to go do? Was that something you knew or just something that kind of happened? Yeah.
No, I had actually applied for graduate school to earn my PhD while I was in Vietnam.
Hmm.
At Arizona State University. And I got into Arizona State University. But then this was 1971, and they said, you've been admitted in, and it was not in history or anything like that. It was in accounting, and a PhD in accounting, which had been boring as hell. I hated everything about accounting, but I liked my graduate program. So I applied for that, got into ASU, but no funding. So I'm coming home, and then I got a job at a place called Lake Superior State College in Michigan. They invited me, but with just my master's degree, I could go teach business courses, and that didn't appeal to me. So I just forgot about all that. Then, at the ripe old age of mid 50s, whatever it was, I decided to go down to University of Houston and see what that was all about. And I applied for the PhD program in accounting. No, excuse me, in political science, because by that time I'd earned another MA in poli-sci. Applied for that. And so they said, yeah, you can come in. So I looked at the program and it looked really bad. It was all quant, all measurement, not issues like my first MA it was. And I didn't care about that. So I went down to the history department and asked them, and they said, well, why don't you take a few courses? So I signed up for a course on called the Vietnam War. And so I took that as an undergraduate, and I took another military history class. And by that time, I'd been out of the oil and gas industry long enough to know that it might be kind of fun just to go to school and read books. And so I went to school and read books for 3 years. I said, how long is this going to take to get this degree? And they said, oh, usually 7 or 8 years. And I said, I don't have that long. So I got I went ahead and earned my PhD and studied the Vietnam War. And I found out that, there was a lot to learn about the war I'd fought in. So that became my interest.
I can't imagine what that must have been like, sitting down your first semester back to school in a while and taking a class on the war.
Oh, yeah, it was pretty interesting. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. Um, And yeah, you know, people around the room look at you and they know you're in a, and they know you're not like them. Although I'll say this, University of Houston was a very, you know, there were not a lot of guys my age, but there were guys that were a little bit younger than me, but that were older than the average student. So I didn't ever feel uncomfortable. I also don't ever, hardly ever remember taking a class that I didn't like. I was one of those, those, those students, that non-traditional students that they called us, that everybody hates because we actually read the books and actually write the papers. And I enjoyed every minute of it. I really did.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so you graduate, you have your PhD in history, and then, what happens next? Where do you go on from there?
I applied for 58 jobs, and I was writing my dissertation. I wrote my dissertation in 6 months, and I remember I would this is you know, you'd see them on the internet, and I'd print the job ad, and I'd hand it to Maxine, and I'd say, write a letter of application for this, fill out this application. And whatever the job was, that was what I was. It was a women's history job, I was a women's historian. It was an environmental job, and she applied for all these jobs all over America. And then I got a couple of callbacks, and one of them was Horton, not Donald Trump's Horton, but Horton Community College down in down south of Houston. And then so I interviewed there and and essentially they hired me, and I get this phone call on and in the meantime I had been named the commencement speaker. And so literally my cap and gown comes in the mail. I open it up and the phone rings, and it's Texas Tech University. And it's Bruce Daniels, who was the chair of the history department at the time. And I hear Maxine on the phone talking to them, and I hear her say, well, first of all, his name's Milam, not Milam. And second, he's not Dr. Milam yet. That's not till tomorrow. And then apparently the guy says, well, I want to talk to you. And so I get on the phone, and the guy offers me the job, a visiting professor job. And I put my hand over the phone and I said, did we apply for a job at Texas Tech? But we didn't know, because we had, like I say, 58 jobs. And so they offered me a visiting professorship, and I'd never even been interviewed. And that was pretty weird. So we came to Texas Tech as a visiting professor, a 2-year visiting professorship that turned out to be a 20-year career.
Yeah. Did that phone call change your commencement speech at all?
That was weird. My commencement speech was about the title of it was The Color of the Blood and the Color of the Mud is the Same. And it was from Colin Powell's My Journey autobiography. And not really, but it was a great honor to be the commencement speaker at U of H. So, yeah.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And so, you mentioned it, right? So you've got this second full career teaching and researching on the war in Vietnam. And, what is your kind of culminating thoughts on that, right? You're not done, obviously, but what's the big takeaway from that? What are you doing now?
I guess the biggest takeaway for me is the attachment that I've taken for military history students. You being one of them, thank you very much. And then my love for the country that I hated. I really was one of those men that came home and kissed the ground and said, I'll never go back to that hellhole. And I just completed my 16th trip to Vietnam this last summer. And I think mathematically, I've done the math that says that I've been I have now spent more time in Vietnam total than I did in my year there, in the amount of trips that I've made back, and I've taught there and everything. So, so I think that Vietnam kind of is a second home, someplace that I truly love, that I look forward to going back to every time. Just got back a few weeks ago, and we'll be going back again next summer. Um, so I think the takeaway is also that that I've there are so many students out there teaching the Vietnam War that somehow or other I've been involved with, and like I say, you being one of those really most successful in that sense, and that makes me very proud. And I've followed most of the careers of all of my students, and they're all doing very well. All the PhDs. I think I have about 13 more in the pipeline right now, and I've hooded 9, and I think I've got 13 and maybe 2 more coming in this year, so that's 15 total. And I don't really have any plans to not continue to do it, and unless health intervenes. So it's been a good career, and I've now pretty much been in education almost as long as I was ever in oil and gas business. The other side of that is probably that being successful in the oil and gas industry allowed me to do some of the things I've done in education. So those two things have kind of gone together, I guess I could say.
Yeah. Okay, so I got a couple like big wrap up questions I want to get to here. And you can, however you want to take these, right? But if you think back on, your time in the Army, right, in the service, what was your favorite part of it, if you have one, if you could pick one?
I think the Army does a good job and did a good job of giving life and death responsibilities to someone at a very young age. I was responsible for not only men that worked for me, but the life and death of a lot of people around me as a mobile advisory leader, a team leader. So from my perspective, I think there were people, men and women and children, that maybe survived because of the things I taught them, because of the care that I gave them, that maybe they survived the war without me having done it. And I did that at a fairly young age. And so to be, 23, 24, 25 years old and having that kind of responsibility sort of sets you up for the rest of your life. I would also say that I try, and I'm probably not as successful as I would like to be, but I try to put everything in perspective of the success that I've had with my life of just being alive. And I think about my buddy Ed, that didn't have the last 50 years that I've had since Vietnam. He didn't have that. He didn't get to live his life and see his girls grow up. And so for me to have seen my son grow up and become successful as a university professor makes me very proud. So the Army and being in a combat situation in the Army every day is pretty valuable. And I try to think about that all the time, that of all the men that never had, the 58,000 men and 8 women that never had what I had for the rest of my life. I'm pretty thankful for that.
Well, and I think your second career has gone above and beyond in sharing the story and teaching people about all of that. So I think you should be really proud of yourself for doing that. This is a weird question that I'm asking everybody I'm interviewing, right? And yours might be kind of hard to answer, right? Would you serve again if you could do it all over again? Would you do any of it differently?
I would serve again if I truly thought that it was necessary to save my family or my country. I did what my country asked me to do. And now that I am old and have relationships with men that I fought against, did the same thing. They did what their country asked you to do. I think war is just about the worst way of solving any issue that you can imagine. Um, Countries sending men and women to kill each other to solve some kind of a problem makes no sense on any level. So I've become a true peace advocate in any way possible and would always try to be helpful in doing that in terms of teaching my students the right side of things. I respect the heck out of men and women that choose to do what I was forced to do. Have great respect for them. Love my country, of course, but I think there are so many other ways of solving problems that killing each other is not one of them. So I try to teach that.
Well, I think you do a really good job of, like you said, keeping it in perspective and asking and bringing people to look at things from a wider perspective. So if you well, and there's a couple other things I'd love to ask you about, but you are in the OCS Hall of Fame, right? How does that make you feel, with all the things we've talked about? What was that moment like?
It was pretty amazing because I believe there was 25 inducted, and I was just about the only one not wearing a uniform, retiring uniform. And on my plaque, it said First Lieutenant retired. And nobody retires as a first lieutenant. Almost everybody was a career officer. So it was special, particularly when I think about how much I really hated the Army, that here they are honoring me, not for what I did in Vietnam or not for any of that, but for what I've done since Vietnam. There aren't very many professors in the OCS Hall of Fame. And I got to go back this last year for a conference down at Columbus University, State University, and then I went back to speak at the changeover of the name. That was really special too, of Fort Benning. So when I went back, it's one of those things that'll always be there. So I'm really proud of it, and hope that the things that I learned as a lead to be a leader, the kind of leadership training that I had, has maybe helped in the rest of the career that I've had, and producing good students who have gone on to do great things. That's kind of my goal now.
Yeah. So what advice would you have for young people who are thinking of entering the military, who maybe are entering the military, serving today? What would your advice be for them?
I have great respect for those that choose to do it, whether for a career or just for a period of time. And I've had so many mothers and fathers ask me about, is their son or daughter doing the right thing when they enlist? I think the military teaches you a lot. And I think at a particular time in your life, I know a lot of stories of guys that didn't know, mostly men in my case, that didn't know what to do with their lives. So they did that, and that turned them around. And then they went on to have successful careers. I have great respect for the people that make a career out of it. It's important. Defense of our country, defense is important. I'm not denying that part of it. Um, so I would advise them to think it through and make sure that it's the right thing for them to do at that point in their life, and then go on with their life and either use what they learn to become successful in something else, or if they choose to stay in, to do that and to do the best job that they can doing that, just like they would in any other work environment.
I think that's really good advice. One last thing before we close it out, right? I think one of the really incredible things that you've done kind of in this second career of yours is work on remembering Vietnam and the generation that served, right? With your work with the Angel Fire Memorial and then your work with the Texas Tech Vietnam Center, right? And so, what has that work meant to you, and what have your takeaways or lessons been from that kind of work?
The last 7 years that I've been involved with the Vietnam Center have been very productive in some ways, but also been very thankful for that. Um, I think that anything that we can do to tell the stories of all of the of all sides. We're now involved we're involved in trying to help find the still 1,581 missing Americans from the Vietnam War. Body parts only, of course, but trying to return those to families. We're involved in that. We're also involved in both of the other two sides of the war, trying to help the communist families find their missing. That means a lot to me, and I think I'll do that for the rest of my life. Because Vietnam for Americans is one of the worst parts of our history. But if we don't tell the stories and we don't record the stories of the men and women who served, that it'll be lost forever. And it's easy to think about World War II veterans in a very positive way because we won that war. But because we lost the war in Vietnam, there's this tendency to think those stories are not as important, when the truth of the matter is they are every bit as important, because the fact that who won and lost is not the critical thing to the things that actually happened. I don't mean to say that every soldier's story is going to make a difference on how we treat our foreign policy, but it is important on the way that we treat those who did serve and those who did fight and those who did of any war. And so I'm very thankful to organizations like yours at UTA that are trying to record these stories that soldiers, that veterans have of their experiences in that particular war. It's going to be the same thing with the wars of your generation, the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's going to be very important that we record those stories because they're important for just for humanity itself to know what these men and women went through. I think it's very important. So I'm glad to be part of that.
Well, I'm honored to include your story in this, and you were one of the first people I wanted to talk to. Is there anything else that I didn't talk about, that I didn't ask, that you'd like to kind of add to the interview here at the end?
No, only that I really respect what you folks at UTA are doing. I think it's great, and every story is important. No matter, that's one of the biggest challenges I have when I ask my students to do oral histories or interviews, is to say everything that anyone did is important. When you take a year out of your life to go risk your life for whatever reason you did it, whether you were drafted or forced to do it or told to do it instead of going to jail, whatever it happens to be, it's important. And so I'm glad that you folks at UTA are doing this. We're trying to do the same things at Texas Tech, and trying to have as history all those things that happened to all of us who did what we did, and we just all did what our individual countries asked us to do. We went and did that. So thank you for what you guys are doing.
Well, like I said, thank you for participating and sharing. I really appreciate it, Ron.
Thank you.